I worked so hard on this.
Then you know how precious time is.
I have to go.
Is this really happening? Don't go.
I've already gone.
She came home from burying her father to find her key didn't turn in her own front door. She stood there a long moment in the black dress she'd worn to the graveside, still holding a single white lily she hadn't had the heart to leave behind, and pressed the doorbell of the house she'd lived in for 11 years. Desmond opened it in a t-shirt she didn't recognize, a duffel bag of someone else's belongings visible on the stairs behind him, and told her, not unkindly exactly, just matter-of-factly, that he'd had some time to think during the service, and he thought it was best they both moved on. He'd already changed the locks. He hoped she understood. What Desmond did not know, standing in the doorway of a house he no longer had any legal claim to as of 11 o'clock that morning, was that 4 hours earlier, in a quiet law office across town, his wife had been formally named sole heir to a fortune worth $120 billion, and the house he was standing in had just become the very least interesting thing she owned. Let me tell you about a woman named Cordelia Achebe Lyle. You would have walked right past her at the grocery store and assumed she clipped coupons out of necessity, not habit. That was always the trouble with Cordelia. She drove a car with a check engine light she never bothered fixing. She let her husband believe, for 11 years, that her father was simply a retired shopkeeper who'd done modestly well for himself. People looked at her and saw an ordinary woman married slightly above her station. They had the whole thing backward. Hold on to that. We are going to come back to it. To understand how a woman stands on her own doorstep, locked out on the day of her father's funeral, and does not so much as raise her voice, you have to go back. All the way back to a hardware store with a hand-lettered sign, and a father who built an empire so quietly that his own daughter didn't fully understand its size until the day he died. Cordelia's father, Solomon Achebe, opened a single hardware store 40 years ago with money borrowed from 3 different relatives who all doubted he'd pay it back within the year. He proved every one of them wrong, and then he did something none of them expected. He kept building, quietly, methodically, buying out struggling competitors across the region, then supply chains, then manufacturing plants, then, over 4 decades, an industrial holding company so vast and so deliberately unglamorous in its branding that most people who used its products every single day had no idea a single family controlled the whole thing. Solomon never gave interviews. He never sat on magazine covers. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation until they wore through at the elbows, and he raised his only daughter to do the same, not out of cheapness, but out of a conviction he repeated to her so many times, it became scripture between them. Money that announces itself, Cordelia, invites people who only want the announcement. Keep it quiet, keep it working, and you'll know exactly who actually loves you, because they'll never have a reason to guess. She believed him completely. She lived by it completely. When she met Desmond Lyle at 26, a charming, ambitious junior architect with a gift for making every room feel like his idea, she told him the truth about her father, in the plainest terms she had. "My dad owns a hardware business," she said, and let Desmond assume the small, modest version of that sentence, because he never once asked a follow-up question sharp enough to find the larger one hiding underneath it. Solomon gave his daughter one thing on her wedding day, a plain steel pocket watch, scratched and unremarkable, that he'd carried in his coat pocket every single day since he opened that first hardware store 40 years earlier. "It doesn't tell better time than any other watch," he told her, smiling. "But I've never once been late to anything that mattered. Carrying it. Keep it close. And remember, the people who love you for the watch in your pocket and the people who'd love you for what's behind it are never the same people. You'll learn to tell them apart eventually. I'm sorry if it takes longer than it should." She kept it in her jewelry box for the 11 years of her marriage that followed. Now hold that thought, because it is going to unravel everything before this script is through. Cordelia herself worked, quietly and by her own choice, as a freelance grant writer for small nonprofits, a modest income by any measure. And she and Desmond had built their entire married life around his architecture salary and her small, steady one, exactly the way Solomon had raised her to want it. Desmond never met his father-in-law more than a handful of times over 11 years. Brief, pleasant, unremarkable visits to a modest house, with a hardware store's original hand-lettered sign framed on the living room wall, and he came away from every single one, convinced there was nothing more to the man than what he saw. Solomon liked it that way. He'd learned, decades earlier, exactly how quickly a son-in-law's warmth could shift once a bigger number entered the room, and he preferred, for his daughter's sake, never to run that experiment. The marriage soured slowly. The way these things do. Desmond's career had stalled somewhere in his early 40s, and the stall curdled, as it does in proud men, into a quiet, simmering resentment he mostly aimed at himself, but occasionally let spill onto the marriage instead. His mother, Yvette, had never much cared for Cordelia, finding her plain and unambitious, a woman with no visible family wealth, worth the trouble of maintaining ties to. And his younger colleague at the firm, a woman named Priya, who'd been quietly encouraging him for the better part of a year, had started suggesting, gently, that Desmond deserved a partner who matched the version of himself he wanted to become. Solomon died suddenly on a Tuesday, a heart attack at his desk in the small hardware store office he still kept, despite everything the business had grown into around it. Desmond attended the funeral dutifully enough, standing beside his wife at the graveside, but he had already, in the weeks leading up to it, made a decision he hadn't told her about. He'd been quietly seeing Priya for 4 months. He'd decided, watching Cordelia grieve a father he still believed had left behind little more than a modest hardware business and a house with an original hand-lettered sign, that this was the moment to finally make his exit clean. Grief made people distracted, he'd reasoned. She wouldn't fight the timing. Now watch close, because this is the part the family lawyer's own office camera actually caught, 4 hours before Desmond ever touched the locks. While Cordelia stood at the graveside in a black dress, holding a single white lily, a will reading was already underway across town, attended by the family's longtime legal counsel and 2 of Solomon's most senior executives, neither of whom Desmond had ever met in 11 years of marriage. The will named Cordelia Achebe Lyle sole heir to the entirety of Achebe Industrial Holdings, a company whose true scope, revealed in full for the first time that afternoon, spanned manufacturing, logistics, and industrial supply operations across 4 continents, valued at $120 billion. Cordelia was not present for the reading. She'd asked, months earlier when her father's health first began declining, for it to be handled privately, without her, because she said she'd rather grieve her father before she had to think about his money at all. She came home straight from the graveside, still in her black dress, still holding the lily, entirely unaware of what had been read into record 4 hours earlier, and found her key wouldn't turn in her own front door. Here is the thing the audience understands now, that Desmond, in all his carefully timed certainty, did not. While he stood in that doorway feeling like a man executing a clean, well-reasoned exit from a marriage he'd quietly decided had nothing left to offer him, his wife had, that very morning, become the sole owner of an industrial empire large enough to make the mortgage on the house he'd just locked her out of look, in the most literal possible sense, like rounding error. The question hanging in the air was not whether Cordelia would be devastated, it was what she would do with a phone call. She did not argue on the doorstep. She did not cry, not there, not in front of him. She simply looked at Desmond for a long moment, reached into her handbag, and closed her hand around a plain steel pocket watch she'd carried with her, without quite planning to. Every day since her father's funeral had been scheduled. Then she turned, walked back to her car, and called the only number she had never once had to use in 11 years of marriage. Her father's longtime attorney, Mr. Faulkner, picked up on the second ring. By the following morning, Faulkner's office had confirmed what Cordelia, in her grief, had genuinely not thought to mention to her own husband the night before, because it had not once crossed her mind as urgent. The house Desmond had just changed the locks on was titled, and had been for 3 years, in a family trust established by Solomon specifically to protect his daughter's residence, a trust of which Desmond had never been named a beneficiary or trustee. He had, in his haste to leave a marriage he believed had nothing left worth fighting for, changed the locks on a house he had exactly zero legal claim to. Cordelia had the locks changed back within the week, this time with a formal notice of trespass mailed to Desmond's new address, care of Priya's apartment, care of certified mail, care of a law firm that answered directly to Faulkner's office. He found out the full scope of what he'd walked away from 3 weeks later, at a small industry mixer, when a colleague mentioned, casually, "Congratulations, by the way, on the Achebe fortune. Must be nice." Desmond laughed, assuming it was some joke about his ex-wife's hardware store father, right up until the colleague, confused by his confusion, pulled up the trade publication, announcing the succession on his phone, and handed it to him without a word. Now the narrator has to tell you what balance looks like when it finally comes back around. It does not arrive loud, it arrives slow, and it arrives total. Start with Desmond. He had built his whole exit strategy on the belief that he was the one making a clear-eyed, rational decision to leave behind a marriage that had grown small and unremarkable, and that Cordelia, grieving and distracted, would be too consumed by loss to notice the timing. That illusion had cost him nothing to believe for 11 years, because his wife had never once made him look down and see what he'd actually been standing next to. The moment the truth reached him, standing at a mixer holding a stranger's phone, he understood he had walked away from more than a marriage. He had walked away from it on the single worst possible day, in the single worst possible way, leaving a documented, dated, notarized record of exactly what kind of man he'd chosen to be on his wife's father's funeral day. His firm, hearing the story secondhand within the month, quietly stopped putting him in front of any client with money. Then there was Priya. Priya had spent months believing she was helping a good man toward a fresh start he deserved. Certain the wife he described, plain, unambitious, financially unremarkable, was the full and accurate picture. When the truth reached her, in the same trade publication that reached Desmond, she understood she had encouraged a man to abandon a fortune the size of a small nation's GDP on the day of his father-in-law's burial, and that the story of exactly how and when he'd done it was now a matter of public record. The relationship did not survive the embarrassment of it for very long. And Yvette had spent 11 years believing her son had married beneath his own quiet potential, a plain woman with no visible family wealth worth cultivating. She learned, from the same trade publication everyone else in Desmond's circle seemed to be reading that week, that the daughter-in-law she'd never bothered getting to know had been the heir to a $120 billion industrial empire the entire time, an empire her son had walked away from over a change of locks. Cordelia did not seek her out for a confrontation. That was never her way. She simply, quietly, let the silence where a mother-in-law's curiosity should have been over 11 years do all the talking that needed doing. A quiet woman is not a weak woman. Remember that. Remember it every time the world looks at a hand-lettered sign on a living room wall and decides there's nothing large standing behind it. Desmond reached out once, months later, a single message, asking if they could talk. Cordelia did not respond for several days, and when she finally did, it was short. "I told you everything that mattered," she wrote. "I told you my father built something real. I told you I loved you before either of us had very much at all. You just never once asked a real question sharp enough to find out how much there actually was. You assumed the answer already, and you were wrong about nearly all of it." He didn't write back. There wasn't an answer that would have mattered. Cordelia runs Achebe Industrial Holdings now, quietly, the way her father did. 3 flannel shirts still hanging in a closet she can't bring herself to donate. A plain steel pocket watch in her jewelry box that she takes out and carries, some days, for no reason she can fully explain, except that it has never once been late to anything that mattered. If this story reminded you that the quiet ones grieving in the back row are sometimes the ones the whole empire answers to, type "The watch keeps time" in the comments so she hears you. Share this with the one person who needs to remember their worth was never something someone else got to lock the door on. And subscribe, because next time, the woman he thinks he's leaving behind might just own everything he's standing on when he does it.